Moral philosophy has a problem. It's confused itself with science. Science, this process of seeking good explanations for phenomena as opposed to bad ones, deciphering what a good one is from a bad one, the subjective, cold, dispassionate process defined by rationality and clear thinking and always seeking to be skeptical of a bevy of biases or emotional crutches which might divert or compromise our calculations and conclusions. It sounds great, right? What's there to criticize? Shouldn't science also govern questions of morality? Well, the 18th century Scottish philosopher David Hume famously gave us what became known as the is-ought distinction, where he thought that this way of thinking, this scientific, rational way of thinking, had its fundamental limits, especially when it came to questions of morality. Simply stated, Hume posited that there is no description of the way the universe is that tells us how the universe ought to be. So, was David Hume ultimately right, and what are we to do about it? So to investigate this question and these problems, I want to inhabit the mind of a rational, secular, science-loving, peace-loving, liberal thinker, and see if we crash right into David Hume's wall. So first, let's paint a picture. A uniformed soldier is at a checkpoint. He's tasked by his government with checking the identification and credentials of certain ethnically defined individuals who wish to physically cross a certain border for whatever reason. He does this task with a certain amount of automation and bureaucratic boredom, every now and then denying someone for a small infraction. He carries a big gun, as do his colleagues, just in case. And someone else is in the line. He's been denied by soldiers wearing the same uniform several times in his life. Even worse, soldiers of the same uniform have beaten him up and his friends in the past. And some of his relatives may have even been maimed or killed by these soldiers. His frustration has been building up, and right now he carries a knife in his pocket. He's unsure if he's going to use it, but he tells himself that if this soldier gives him any trouble today, he's going to stab him to death. So let's start with a moral assumption that killing and violence are bad things that ought to be avoided, minimized, reduced, etc. And that all parties involved in this picture would wish to reach an ultimate state of relative peace and existential freedom. All humans seek this, even if they might have very different conceptions of what elements must be in place for that emergent state of peace to arise. It could even be a state of being which only is reserved for the afterlife, or it could only arrive after a long process of terrestrial carnage here on planet Earth. Or it could only happen to a limited degree if it was couched in a Leviathan-like surveillance and control state which we must submit to in order to protect ourselves from our own worst impulses. But set those process differences aside and return to the situation at hand, because we have a bit of an emergency on our hands. And let's push our scientific rational view even further. The strict scientific loving view of the situation might come to describe everything in terms of physical systems, beholden to discoverable laws of motion or interaction. These are ultimately non-conscious processes which combine and swarm in particular ways to give rise to the phenomena that we call humans, or clothes, or cars, or knives, or books. This is a strict scientific view which leaves no room for a metaphysical soul, or at best reduces that idea to a mysterious, undeniable brute fact of consciousness itself, which is cast as a merely passive, subjective witness to the physical world. And systems such as these are prone to an illusion where they merely convince themselves that they are the genuine author of their actions. But in fact, the rational, secular scientific thinker contends that this conviction, that your consciousness is the cosmic and somehow uncaused causer of your behavior and thoughts, is an illusion which breeds suffering, and thus the disillusion of the self becomes a prime goal for many of these thinkers. The cosmically responsible identification to one's own thoughts and behaviors becomes the spell to break for these so-called enlightened rational philosophers. But this is not to say that the rational thinker dismisses the eminent truth of consciousness, this strange window where all sensation and experience surfaces. In fact, they understand that the presence of this mysterious thing is the thing which dictates moral concern and moral consideration for objects in our universe. The objects, which perhaps foolishly convince themselves that they are really subjects, are the ones which can experience states of suffering and flourishing, and therefore the ones we must consider in our moral analysis. That might sound deeply philosophical and technical, but we do this all the time whether we know it or not. It's why you don't morally worry about a stick falling from a tree and hitting the ground, but you might morally worry about a monkey falling from the same tree, and if you could only catch one of them mid-fall, you'd probably choose the monkey over the stick, because of that assumption of morally relevant consciousness being present in one and not the other. This whole scientific description, which erases a kind of ultimate free will and shuns religious conceptions of reward and punishment, is starting to sound a bit technical and aloof, but thinkers of this stripe will tell you that it actually is the basis for increased compassion. You see, a hurricane is just a physical system of forces. It's not responsible for being a hurricane. It has no awareness of being a hurricane. In other words, it has no recursive consciousness. It has no conscious states of suffering or flourishing. It's not asking itself what kind of hurricane should it be. Oh, is it a good hurricane? Am I a bad hurricane? It's just happening. But that hurricane might be hurtling towards a coastal town, which is full of physical systems that we call humans and animals, who do seem to have that important recursive consciousness thing. And that hurricane is on target to increase a lot of their suffering if it hits. So, if I had a magical wand which could somehow take the hurricane and eliminate it without causing any side effects, this would be a good action, of course, right? My using the magic wand and dissolving the hurricane isn't about punishing the hurricane for being a hurricane. It's simply trying to deal with the problem of the hurricane and reduce suffering. So the rational scientific thinker applies this thinking to our situation at the checkpoint. The humans in the picture are just like various weather patterns, with that important moral exception that they contain an awareness of being. But just like the hurricane, even these humans are not ultimately responsible for their actions, beliefs, thoughts, or anything else. They are emergent results and ongoing processes of physics. They are each products of nature or nurture at every point in time, which in turn was a product of the previous point and state of the universe. And wherever you slice that timeline and investigate, you will have to conclude that they did not choose their nature, nor did they choose their nurture. And if you insist on injecting a metaphysical soul into the picture, well, they didn't choose that either. And no amount of quantum randomness nor hard determinism will rescue the logic of ultimate free will, and you will come to the conclusion that they are merely very strange weather systems. We still must take a course of action, because even once you start to drain cosmic responsibility from the picture and conclude that luck, randomness, or indifferent determination swallows everything, you still want to maximize flourishing and minimize suffering, and certain weather systems are more likely to do one of those things. And so, you decide you should intervene, just like you did with the hurricane. And so the rational thinker assesses the situation and removes the man with the knife. Again, not out of any kind of cosmic punishment or racism, but simply because that particular weather system presented an imminent danger, even if he isn't ultimately responsible for being dangerous. So it's not about punishment. It's about reducing danger and suffering. So instead of killing the person, you might try to change the weather system. Just like some technology, like a hurricane changing deposit that you drop in might rearrange the molecules of the clouds into something much more pleasant, like a spring breeze, you might attempt to reform or convince this human hurricane to be something else. That would be the preferred method here. If you could successfully do that and they lose the knife, then this person should be free to go about their business as they pose no future danger to your moral project of increasing flourishing. And if you could scale this process up and be successful, perhaps this entire checkpoint would no longer be needed, and every physical system would be spring breezing all along. Right? This is the scientific, rational, compassionate mindset. And if you listen carefully, it stresses compassion rather than retribution or punishment. But of course, if you cannot reform or alter this weather system of a person and they are posing an ongoing problem, regrettably, you might just have to kill them. Killing them, of course, is the same thing that you did to the hurricane. You're simply rearranging a bunch of physical forces and atoms, so it does not emerge in the same way anymore. But in the case of the person, this means that, of course, the recursive consciousness process would no longer be happening. In other words, death. This explains how a rational-minded scientific thinker can endlessly use the word tragedy when speaking about these kinds of things. It's how they can speak of something like the nightmare of collateral damage and really mean those things. It's how they can disdain invocations of racist or religious celebrations of killing while piling up mountains of regrettable and tragic interventions in which other methods of non-lethal intervention first failed. For the science-minded thinker, the word tragedy does a lot of work. This way of thinking about solving moral problems is called the quarantine model of justice, and it sounds very rational, very compassionate. A quarantine is not a punishment, it's just separating someone until they are no longer a danger. It's a very kind of reasonable and attractive position to people who just don't want to talk about gods and demons and souls and insist that science ought to guide our policy and that science can build its own system of morality and justice. Now, the problems with this whole thing, and there are many, but if you are a thinker who is attracted to this kind of utilitarian, science-minded approach to the world, which I've so far offered, there are ways out of it through the center of the maze. So stay tuned. But first, the first problem. Causal explanations, it turns out, are not so easy to nail down. So if we agree that there is a potential tragedy awaiting us here, and the intention in the person waiting in line is the immediate proximal variable, which is about to cause it, okay, we need to ask how and why that intention is there in the first place. And if you're asking the question why at all, you're always approaching the edge of a bottomless cliff. For example, what is the explanation for the knife in this man's pocket? Well, he put it there. No, that's not good enough. Well, he's angry about being treated badly. He's fed up with the situation after decades of nonviolent attempts to change things. Perhaps he wants revenge on this particular soldier. Perhaps he is suicidal. Perhaps he has a religious justification and motivation in his head. Perhaps he's suffering from a level of cultural humiliation and alienation which has driven him mad. Perhaps he just feels impotent. Who knows, right? All of these things, some of these things, none of these things, we can debate these things all day. But when it comes to the question of applying the rational, scientific, peace-loving-minded intervention, it does really matter. Because again, you don't hate this person. They aren't cosmically responsible for this knife in their hand. And sure, you might want to put a stop to the imminent usage of it and quarantine the man, not out of punishment, but out of serving this project of reducing suffering. But then what? What system do you attempt to alter or change in order to reduce the future threats to flourishing? Do you get to work on changing ideas in his head and reforming him? Is that the way to do it? Does that get at the conditions which are producing so many little dangerous hurricane humans? Or is it something else, like economic or political systems of humiliation or exploitation or domination? How are we to decide what needs to change and in what order? I mean, even in the case of the non-conscious but dangerous hurricane, how would you answer the question as to explain why the hurricane is happening? Well, the physical forces may be enough of an answer, but there's also climate change, which heats the oceans and might increase the frequency and intensity of hurricanes like this. And sure, there might be an immediate intervention there that has to be done. Disarm the knife, dissolve the hurricane, but then what? What needs to be changed? When does the rational thinker get around to that work? And this crashes us right into the second problem. This way of thinking tends to focus only on immediate rather than distal or systemic causes of increased suffering. There's another famous thought experiment conjured up in an essay by Peter Singer where he imagines you walking along a path after having just purchased a new pair of shoes when you come across a shallow pond where you spot a struggling, drowning child. Singer asks, quite simply, if you would jump into the pond and rescue the child while knowing that you would ruin and soil your brand new pair of shoes. Well, duh. Of course you would. Where is the serious question here? Well, then he points out how we are nearly always in this situation if we just think about it more clearly and eliminate the arbitrary variable of distance. For example, if Singer could come up to you at the moment at the shoe store when you were about to purchase the new pair of shoes for, say, $200, and he presented to you an opportunity to donate to a charity which would guarantee that it could save the life of a child on the other side of the world for the cost of, let's say, $200, would you buy the shoes or make the donation? Singer stresses how the question is precisely the same morally. The only difference is the psychological engagement with seeing, hearing, and immediately sensing the drowning child in front of you. The fact that we feel differently about the two situations is a bug in our moral thinking, and we ought to work around it. The scenario has been challenged by thinkers like Kwame Appiah, who say the rational response actually should be to not save that drowning child, but to run to the nearest pawn shop and sell them your shoes along with your brand new suit and receive $400 and then donate to the charity and save 2 children. You could extend this thinking in fun ways where you end up making arguments for trying to make as much money as you possibly can in order to donate even more and save even more children with the kind of earn to give argumentation. This thought experiment is the building block of movements like effective altruism, and I find it emotionally compelling, but I think you can start to see the same flaws with it that I do. Okay, so save the child. By the way, I totally saved the child. But when are we going to ask questions like, how did she get in there in the first place? Why isn't there a fence? How do we prevent more children from ending up in the pond? Maybe the city should do something, and who's throwing children into the pond? I'm asking questions that are concerned with distal or systemic causes for this point of suffering, which always seem to take a back seat perpetually to the emotional constant emergency of a drowning child. In fact, an anti-capitalist argument that you might put forward was that while you're busy making all of that money in order to donate more of it, you might be directly contributing to a system which ensures an increase in metaphorical drowning children, and you're creating an endless game of whack-a-mole where you are perpetually saving children from the systems you are supporting, which are drowning them. In fact, that original essay from 1971 from Singer was written as a plea for the Western world to respond to a famine in Bengal following a 1971 East Pakistan war. And the complex historical and political and economic and colonial systems at play to create that metaphorical shallow pond are all on the table to discuss, if we would ever get around to doing that. And that brings us to the third problem. The hijacking of the scientific rational mindset to entrench power systems of oppression. So my very thinly veiled analogy clearly surfaces to mind all of these conversations where the immediate threat of the knife exists in a conversation with the backdrop of colonialism and Zionism and historical humiliation and capitalism and religious devotions and plenty of other isms to discuss, which can feel academic and dry and sometimes impenetrable in their complexity and causal relationships. But the pending knife attack feels very scary and simple and not complicated, and thus it rises in its attraction to deal with, and it gets the name, like terrorism, to drown out all of the other jargon. So, if there is some truth, for example, to the argument that a system like capitalism necessitates exploitation in its infinitely expanding search for resources to pay its own debts and handle its own overproduction, and this search demands philosophies of domination or hierarchical relationships, such as colonialism, which thus necessitates forms of racism to morally justify the whole dynamic. And in this system or relations, one will inevitably create resentment and resistance with various forms of religious and non-religious and political justifications. Thus, the oppressive system which benefits a few guarantees resistance, and if that resistance is violent in its nature, it will take center stage in the discourse and serve as an endlessly valuable, emotionally powerful cover from ever getting around to challenging the system in the first place. This is the hijacking of the discourse and emotional responses we have, and how, for example, it becomes rational for Zionism to think of something like Hamas as an asset, or, of course, for early American Manifest Destiny advocates to use violent resistance from the Native Americans as propaganda tools to expand their territory, all while calling it regrettable and tragic. It must be said that this hijackable nature of this scientific rational attitude can play on oneself, where many people who hold this position may also be benefiting from these systems of oppression that I mentioned, and therefore must cast the victims of it as hopelessly irrational, murderous, or even ungrateful. They must be cast as engaged in unprovoked violence, enraptured by ideas which cannot be addressed in any way by reforming or dismantling any earthly systems. Because if that is true, well then, no analysis of economic or racist systems matters. Importantly, these thinkers reserve the right to apply this standard and sort of motivational tripwire of religious or metaphysically grounded motivations for violence to any ethnic or religious group where they may become irrationally enraptured. And this critique is what they claim excludes them from charges of tribalism or bias or racism. Though these critiques are often frustratingly tepid and often expressed as unfortunate responses or reactions to the initial conditions of barbarism or irrationality in their neighborhoods. You'll hear the causality for their own supposed derangement and irrationality foisted upon the surrounding conditions in yet another way to gruesomely perpetuate power. This is why so many of these thinkers go to great lengths and do impressive mental gymnastics to discount, disregard, or simply erase or deny history. And they tend to scoff at analysis of systems as just a bunch of woke nonsense. And while there are excesses of argumentation and oversteps into romanticization of the oppressed and even apologetics for methods of violence and the ways resistance can entrench into vengeance, and maybe how power tends to corrupt any political movement, even resistance movements, all of that can be found and rightfully be derided, but many of these rational thinkers refuse to engage with the abundance of serious argumentation and analysis, which is fully aware of those perils. There are tons of us on offer. In fact, I think it's most of us. So when someone insists on only engaging with the worst forms of argumentation against their position, you know it's a sure sign of someone with an insecure position. And finally, the last problem with this science-centered and rational way of thinking is that it cannot contend with deeper existential questions of flourishing and suffering. This is the way to escape the cold, hard utilitarian attitude from the center, because a human is not a hurricane, which is simply making a foolish mistake of falling for the illusion that it is a hurricane with this subjective feeling of free will. We do have this strange recursive consciousness and a subjective feeling of free will, which might be categorized as an illusion and yet still be morally sacred. Illusions are real. They're really happening, just as real as a rainbow. Just don't mistake it for a streak of paint hanging in the sky. So this dual picture of man as both a biological and physical machine purely beholden to the mechanics of determinism or quantum randomness, and a thing of consciousness and subjectivity and freedom and moral narratives and the ability to imagine counterfactual pasts and presents and futures and evaluate them morally, that tension between what the philosopher Wilfrid Sellars called the scientific image of man and the manifest image of man, that friction is the human condition. And as Sellars insists, it's philosophy's job to somehow get these two things to hang together. And to do that requires poetry and art, philosophy and effort. To flourish, really to flourish, is to feel a belonging in this picture. And to suffer is to disconnect and be rejected by it. The rational-minded scientific attitude has cast man as a pleasure-seeking thing which desires states of spiritual or cosmic connection and oneness, sure, and they might even be worried that a hyper-consumerist, hedonistic picture of man is a bit of a false vision of these things, which is not perfectly corrected by market forces alone. But what if this picture of connection and oneness and existential freedom which we seek requires narratives about dignity and equality and justice and respect to be deeply felt and shared? And what if some of those flimsy ideas of dignity and justice involve historical entanglements and potentially impossible hurdles to jump and apologies to offer and to receive and unavoidably imperfect paths of reconciliation and potentially unlearning many deeply embedded narratives of identity and meaning and ancestry? What if that stuff is not the sideshow to this quest of maximizing flourishing and minimizing suffering, but it's the most important ingredient to it? What if you adopt a kind of Homo economicus view of man and ignore all of that stuff at your peril, and it becomes a festering time bomb which one day will inevitably bring down a collective civilizational project in some act which I'm sure will be derided as enormously irrational? So now, at the bottom of this philosophical inquiry, we find an ignored discussion about the nature of man, and we find the scientific rational thinker has too hastily swept aside these difficult variables to calculate and cast man as a selfish, pleasure-seeking type of hurricane which practices his freedom in the marketplace as Homo economicus and who should desire a world that looks like this. And if he had this, he might simply just forget about all that dignity stuff of the past. And any agent in the world which doesn't operate like this and share this view seems to just be a glitch or an error or a mistake, which unfortunately must just be eliminated or bulldozed on the way to our shiny, beautiful future. But I contend they are wrong about man, and they are wrong about flourishing and suffering and what ingredients must be included and considered to generate those states. And true grappling with our deepest desires and simultaneous fears of freedom and existence must be done before we turn morality into a math equation. And if not, one will always be maximizing false and unsustainable flourishing and mistaking pain for suffering. And so the question, was David Hume right? Is there a description of the way the universe is, which is the quest of science, which tells us how the universe ought to be, which is the pursuit of morality? Well, I think Hume was ultimately right. But if there is some truth to a narrative that we have about a universe of pointless, consciously experienced pain and suffering, and a universe of infinite flourishing and pleasure, if that's to have any operational meaning, well, a science-minded person will come to think of this as a navigation problem or a measurement problem. And the quest is to move from bad to good. And if there is to be a kind of science of suffering and flourishing, or that a pursuit of science can better inform the physical states which correlate to those subjective things, then fine. For these kinds of thinkers who are attached to the scientific rational way of approaching questions, then the project should be to discover patterns or laws or scientific truths of human behavior and descriptions of the human condition which are more and more accurate. And perhaps a proposed law of behavior might be that where there is oppression, there will be resistance. And where dignity and justice is denied, It will be sought in all forms, from knives to speeches to hunger strikes and everything in between. And that oppression need not be only external or historical or political, it can be our own psychological and existential barriers. And even that, given this law, will generate resistance. So a plea to all of the rational, secular-minded, scientific thinkers applying this to morality out there. I know what you're doing, and I see what you're trying to do, but please, even when it's difficult, even when it's risky, incorporate arguments of historical injustice and how they factor into real conditions of flourishing into your argumentation. Consider systems of analysis of oppression and resistance into your argumentation. Contend with the best arguments against you. Because if you don't, I think you're being terribly used and terrible scientific thinkers and guaranteeing a whole lot more knives in pockets and drowning children.